Well, it's Friday night, and we get to add 2 minutes into our time bank for our Friday night evidence-based triathlete podcast.
I think this is the first time we've ever been early.
Right, we are right there.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
well, tonight's
episode
gonna.
125, and we finally did it.
That's right. That's right. Well, tonight's gonna be a lot of fun because not only do we have our evidence-based triathlete, which really we call two guys talking triathlon, but we have a special guest tonight, Dr. Jim Martin from University of Utah. Hi, Jim. How are you?
Fine. How about yourself?
Good. Well, you look toasty warm up there right now. I love your background, which you said earlier, that's about what it looks like outside, huh?
Pretty much identical. Yeah, we started getting snow a couple of days ago, and now my fitness program is called Shovel Fit.
That doesn't go well down here, that's all. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a lot of fun. I've known Jim, I don't know, I don't remember, Jim, when the first time I met you. It would have been at the American College of Sports Medicine conference, or maybe one of the Biomechanics Society conferences, probably 20 some odd years ago. And I'll tell
Mhm.
you, I've always liked going to Jim's presentations and talking with him because he is such an innovator and he has such a unique way doing experiments, or in a way that yields some really new information and new knowledge.
Hmm.
And so he really has an expertise in cycling research, and it's going to be fun to hear some of his knowledge, and we'll pick his brain on cycling. But before I get going too far, Jim, maybe just give us a brief background of your academic career, but then I also want you to describe your cycling background because I think that's really important.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I started my professional life as a mechanical engineer, working as a professional engineer, but also racing bikes, and set some goals for myself in cycling. And Masters National Championship was one of my goals, and I worked towards that, and I eventually won that. And So uh, then, I'm kind of goal oriented. So, okay, check that box. What's next? And I'd always had this vague notion that I want to go into to be a professor. And so I started grad school and started in engineering, which is the work I was doing, of course. But one thing and another, and because I continued to coach after I quit racing. And so I was always thinking about muscular power, right? I was a match sprinter and I coached match sprinters. And somewhere along the way, my training partner, Trey Gannon, did an experiment at University of Texas in their kinesiology department. Actually, I think it was run by Andy Coggan. And one thing and another, and he somehow, I really don't know how this unfolded, but we started having brown bag lunches with Ed Coyle, right outside of the stadium there. And one thing and another, and I switched majors. I switched from engineering to exercise science, and it's been a dream come true ever since.
Oh, oh, I love it. And yeah, you're hanging out with some real thinkers and some ways of challenging ideas, which again is something I've always appreciated about you, is going to one of the sessions that you'd be at, and you're always good at asking a question that really drove people to think. And so that was always fun.
I
So
thought you were going to say drove them to the brink, or drove them to throw something at me,
no,
because I have those stories for you.
no, it's always good when you get that dialogue going, and there's so much learning that can happen when we go down that path. So tonight we're going to talk cycling, and we're going to talk about some of your area of work that you've done on cadence and crank length. But I know Ted's chomping at the bit for a question here.
Yeah. So, my first question is, how do I determine my optimal crank length? And then I'm gonna give you a little scenario here. And should it be different between my road bike and my time trial bike?
Yeah. So the answer is about tenfold.
Yep.
So first of all, Believe it or not, and most cyclists don't believe it, but all of our data say that across a range from 145 millimeters to 195 millimeters, which, you know, would be a pretty large range, crank length does not affect efficiency during submaximal cycling, so it shouldn't affect your endurance, and it doesn't affect your maximal sprinting power. So because of that, because we know, or at least our data show, that it doesn't make a difference, then you can start to use crank length as you would any other fitting parameter. No different than a stem length or a bar width, seat height. So the answer there is go with the crank length you like until you don't like it. And what I mean by that is if you have a relatively long crank for your leg, however tall you happen to be, then there'll be a point when you're trying to get aero, and suddenly your thigh is thumping you in the chest, and that's probably not so good. So, you know, what a lot of people do then is they go, oh, I got too low, I got to raise my handlebars back up.
Yep.
But what you could do instead is lower your thigh by using shorter cranks. So you just change the range of motion of that thigh, and you can get more aero positions. What I throw out the example that, so I'm 5'8", 158 pounds or something, and not long ago I was setting up a time trial bike to be UCI legal for track time trial work, and in order to get a truly horizontal torso and still pedal comfortably, I had to go to 145 cranks. And, you know, I rode them, and they do not affect power and they don't affect efficiency, but boy, do they allow you to be comfortable in an extreme aero position.
Yeah, no, I love that. You know, just last year on my time trial bike, I went to 160 millimeter cranks, and man, well, number one, it's really hard to find. I did, you know, I sourced them and I got them, and I just felt so much more comfortable. You know, my hips were open, and I went from 170 to 160, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's, you know, it's 10 millimeters on the top, 10 millimeters on the bottom, and I instantly felt better.
Oh yeah.
And, you know, but then on my road bike, I kept at 170, but I never felt compressed, you know, because I'm not in that same, you know, folded over position. And you know, and of course, you know, the naysayers out there like, oh, you're going to 160, oh, you're going to lose all sorts of power. I'm like, I don't think I am. I have a pedal-based power meter, and I'm pushing the same wattage, so I don't really see. And then I'm on a Wahoo kicker, and I also see the power being produced at the cassette, and it's the same. So I'm more comfortable. I'm actually more aero, and so to me it was win-win. And then the frustrations for me were actually, honestly, I just built a new bike, was finding another set of 160 cranks. It's actually hard to find. I don't know how you found 145s. I mean, did you have them milled yourself?
Well, yes, I did. I actually did them in my garage, but the benefits of being an engineer first.
Right.
But actually, let me let you in on a little secret. So you can get really nice short cranks with, you know, modern bottom brackets and so forth from John Cobb.
Right.
But if you don't want to ante up for the really nice ones that he sells, do a Google for either Origin 8, Origin in the number 8, or SINZ, S-I-N-Z. Last time I looked, they had gone up in price, and I think they were $79.
Yeah, that's pretty cheap.
And they go down to 110 or 120, which we use on some physical activity things for desks and what have you. But they have a range. You can get them on Amazon. The only trick is that you have to use square taper bottom bracket, which it was okay for decades, but suddenly now it's terrible. So Yeah, I can't use that anymore.
You know, I just realized that we're throwing out these numbers 170,
Oh, yeah.
172.5, 165. I think, Ted, do you want to describe that or
Sure. I mean, that's pretty, I mean, it's literally the length from the center of the spindle to where the center of the pedal is, and it's in millimeters. So 100 typical, like when you buy a bike off of the shelf, this kind of standard is 172.5. Now, Jim, you might know the answer to why that's the number, but I mean, I can't find out. I have no idea why that became the ubiquitous number. But that is the ubiquitous number, and it kind of makes the assumption that everybody's the same, and everyone's femurs are the same length, and everyone's tibias are the same length. But so that's the number that we're talking about, is in millimeters. So Jim, do you know the answer to why 172.5 became the standard?
No idea at all.
This is a Jeopardy question.
I know that historically, if you look at the really old, 1920s stuff, you'll actually see them with a slot and a nut so that you could slide it, and you could make big changes in crank length. We all got set in our ways. It's remarkable how devoted some people are to that length, like within 1 or 2 millimeters. And actually, I let me tell you, and this is a fun story. So proprioception, the ability of your joints to sense motion, is actually really, really sensitive,
right,
to range of motion. And so when I did my original study, which was 120s to 220s, so we don't screw around with 167.5, 175, and 172.5. We like signal to noise ratio in my lab. So what was funny is this was during my graduate days at my dog wants to be fed. Hang on. Well, okay, he'll just have to wait. So graduate days at Texas, and parking is absolutely impossible at University of Texas. So you have to ride your bike to campus. Hang on a second.
what's his name?
Walter, come here, Walter.
Hey, Walter.
There we go.
Poor Walter, we scheduled this during his dinner time. That's not.
Usually it's Cosmo that makes an appearance.
Yeah, normally my dog's making the problems during
Our mascot is Cosmo.
Well, I'd have to turn off my filter, but yeah, right now he's got a stuffy toy and he's very happy about it. So back to this. So you have to ride your bike to come do the study with me. All my subjects did. And so they'd ride their bike to the lab, they'd come up in the elevator, they'd do my study, and they all universally made fun of whatever length they were on. So if they were on short cranks, every single one of them would spontaneously start the Circus Bear song. And then when they got on long cranks, they would make some other sound that was kind of like, and we'd all laugh and ha ha ha. And then they'd do the protocol, and power would be just the same as it was on the other ones, and then they'd take off. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because every single one of them, 16 people in the study, they all came back to me at some point and said, it's funny. When I came to the lab, I rode in on my road bike. It's like I've been riding for 10 years or whatever. And your cranks felt funny to me. But, I was up there for 20 minutes. And then I went back down and I got on my road bike and my road bike felt funny. So two things. Yes, you can tell a difference instantly, but you get used to it really quickly. So I guess that plays into the fact that, for instance, you're riding 160s and 170s on your two bikes, and it probably doesn't bother you at all.
I can't even feel a difference.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more mental now too. Like the road bike is going to feel like this, the time trial bike is going to feel like this, but they always felt different anyways, right? Because the position was different. Now, when I switched from the 170s to the 160s, the first 10 minutes felt weird.
Hmm.
Then felt,
Yeah.
it just felt the same. And I felt like I was kind of winning, to be honest with you.
Well, for a while I was writing 155s because I had a hip issue. And what's funny is I don't know how to describe this. I'll say it, but it doesn't make any sense. I felt tall.
Yeah.
I'm 5'8". So somehow I felt tall because my leg was always more extended.
Yep.
And I guess in my mind's eye, suddenly I felt like tall guys look on bikes. So tall guys ride relatively short cranks. They just don't know it.
Right.
So yeah.
And I'm 5'8" as well. And I think forever I was on too long of cranks for me.
For arrow shape, yeah.
For the arrow shape on the time trial bike. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was always doing different things with the front end and the saddle just to try and open my hip angle up and feel better. And I never
Mhm.
felt great until I did that.
Yeah.
Maybe throw on the 170 on your left side and the 160 on your right side. See what happens. Does anyone ever do that for leg length discrepancies, Jim?
Not so much for leg length. I actually did it. So my hip issue eventually led to surgery. And when they released me to go back to bike commuting, I put one of those tandem kid crank shorteners on the surgical side. And so I was riding 170 and 100. And that felt ridiculously funny for, the first few blocks, and then I got used to it. So
It's amazing how the body adapts to changes in situation like that. But how about, a lot of times you read anecdotally, people say, well, I want longer cranks because I do a lot of climbing. I mean, where does climbing enter this equation, or does it at all?
yeah, it does. So what they're really saying is I don't want to give up torque. And fair enough. But what most people who haven't been through a kinesiology program don't quite get is there's more to it than the lever arm, right? In fact, we were talking about slow twitch earlier. When I was getting ready for a talk once, I actually went out on slow twitch and I said, look, all the data shows that crank length doesn't matter, but some people push back. Will one of you tell me why? And only one person responded. I should have the username, but I don't remember right now. And he said, okay, I'll give it a go, because I learned in grade school that torque is lever arm times force, and I want a longer lever arm, so I have more torque. And that's true, except for one thing, which is you're assuming that the force is going to stay the same. And it won't, for two reasons. First of all, if you're pedaling at let's say 90 RPM, if you're on a longer crank, the pedal's moving faster. So your muscles are shortening faster, so they produce less force. Okay, so that's one. The other thing is when you change from a shorter to a longer, well, let's go from a standard to a shorter crank. What most people do is they raise their saddle by the difference in the crank length so that their maximum extension stays the same. Angle at the, their hip and knee and ankle angles at the bottom stay the same. Well, what that means is that at every other point in the cycle, except the bottom, their leg is more extended. Okay, right?
Yep.
Because it doesn't come up as high. So everywhere else in the cycle, you're extended. Now, think about going into the gym. And for which are you stronger, a partial squat or a deep squat?
Partial.
Yeah, a lot stronger. You can do a lot more weight for a partial squat because of what we would call in my field biomechanical gear ratio, which I won't nerd out on you. John's nodding, but all it means is that your muscles have more leverage against the ground, so to speak, and so because of the combined effects of force velocity and the leg extension, biomechanical gear ratio, you don't lose as much torque as you imagine you might. So what we found, at least for sprinting, it looks like you don't give up power, but the power cadence relationship changes. But it doesn't change by as much as the crank length difference. So what it does change by about half. So let's just say you changed crank length by 20%, then you would want to change your gearing by about 5%, right? So I'm sorry, by 10%, 20 and 10. So you might go down on a chain ring by, a few teeth to compensate, and then it would all feel pretty much the same. Am I making sense at all?
Yeah, you are, but and then that leads me to a question then. So when I went to shorter crank lengths, should I have went to a smaller front chain ring?
You could, or you could just go up a tooth in on the cog.
Yeah.
But it ends up being so. So for instance, if so you went 1/17, right? You went from 170 to 160.
Yeah.
So that's 1/17. So then I would recommend changing your gearing by 1/34, which would basically be
A tooth and a half.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter.
Not really much of difference if I'm on a 5339, right? I have a lot of range there anyways. And now, and nowadays too, the rear mechs are so big, and the rear, I have on my time trial bike, believe it or not, I have an 1134.
Yeah, wow, 34
Right.
sounds great for the canyons around here.
Yeah, and for like our mountains around here, it's awesome. And so we have such big ratios now anyways, it's probably not even relevant. I can get into basically any gear ratio I want at any time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's somehow it's really scary, but in the end, as you've learned, it doesn't really make much difference.
Then I guess the question is it, and we came up to the point that it's not that expensive, but it can be quite expensive if you go like, carbon but really, if it's not that expensive, I think it's worth, for the average triathlete, like trying different crank lengths and seeing how they can change their fit, and working with a fitter that understands, that you can actually change crank length. I think sometimes fitters, they get nervous about that. It's because it's a difficult thing to do, right? Like mechanically, it's not like, just moving your saddle or moving this. To change a crank length takes time and effort.
Yeah. Changing out the bottom bracket and so forth. Sure.
Yeah. And not too many fitters are going to have a bunch of different spindles and spindle widths and just the ability to, let's just change this out really quick. And it's, now with some fitting bikes, we can do it. And, and most of the, high-end fitting bikes, you'll be able to do it relatively quickly. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I want to step back just a little bit, because you've talked about cadence as well. We've talked about cadence as well, and crank length. I'm curious, when you started your research, which area were you most interested in, crank length or cadence? And looking back now, could you study one without the other?
Yeah, you have to study them both. And in fact, so in the US, you can't be a sports scientist and really get a lot of respect. So my lab, we don't study cycling. We swear up and down, we do not study cycling. We study cyclical muscle contraction, and it turns out that cycling is a good model to do that. But so with that in mind, when I came to grad school, I was coaching Nick Chenoweth, Masters national champion, and Trey Gannon, national team member. And Nick was 6'5" with relatively long legs, and Trey was 5'8" with relatively short legs. And so, they rode longer and shorter cranks. Trey rode 165s and Nick rode 167.5s. And I, at the time I thought that can't be optimal, but how do you find out? And so one thing and another, and my PhD ended up being in growth development and aging. And that gave me the justification to study crank length within the context of making sure you get valid measurement in children. But of course, you don't want to start in children. You want to start with reliable trained cyclists. This is how you justify. And so that began that study that I just talked about in my graduate work. But I knew that, or at least I had the intuition that when you changed crank length, you also had to expect a change in the power cadence relationship. And so that actually led me to my master's thesis was to develop a measurement technique that gives you the entire power cadence relationship in one short test, rather than having to do, different loads or different cadences. And yeah, we were shocked to find that it just didn't really matter. In that original study, the 120s and the 220s, so the two extremes, were a little bit lower, I think around 4% lower. And that was significantly different than the middle three. But, we're talking 4% for, going from, in that case, 170 to 120. So these are big differences, and the differences in power are actually pretty small.
That's super interesting. Now, in the running work that I've done, we've done a lot of manipulating of cadence during running, and I've always found that once someone has a cadence, it's so hard to change their cadence, like to have them go 5% faster, or 10% faster for a given speed. And so we always have to, stay on them when we're saying, okay, run at, 10% faster cadence. In cycling, is that the same issue, that if you jump on a bike, you start biking, do you pick a particular cadence that you really like and it's hard to change it, or is it easy to manipulate the cadence?
Well, it's easy to manipulate. Now, will you want to is a different question. So self-selected cadence, I honestly haven't done much work in self-selected cadence. I was working with Tom Korf when he was at Brunel, and somewhere on one of his hard drives is a data set with self-selected cadence across a big range of crank lengths. But the student didn't finish, and then Tom left academia to go to work for Frog Bicycles, and so he never wrote the paper. But what I remember from the preliminary data was we thought that maybe they would maintain pedal speed. So a combination of crank length and cadence that would make the pedal go around in the circle at the same rate. And they didn't do that. They actually tended to go closer to another variable that we came up with, which sort of takes cadence twice and then crank length once. So if that turned out to be true when we eventually got all the data, which we probably never will, although maybe Tom will hear this, then you would be pedal. It seemed like the subjects were pedaling at a slightly lower pedal speed with the shorter cranks, and that would actually be more efficient, because when we did crank length and metabolic efficiency, we found that metabolic efficiency tracked exactly with pedal speed. And so if you self-select a lower cadence, a lower pedal speed, you're actually more efficient. So that it could be that short cranks are actually more efficient. We show that they're not. There's no difference, but that's when you account for pedal speed. If you choose a different pedal speed, then they might be more efficient.
I love it. And so good to just distinguish between pedal speed and cadence. I know mathematically the relationship, but pedal speed is literally you're getting that from the cadence and from the crank arm.
That's right.
Yeah, and so it's just how fast, in essence, linear the pedal is actually moving, and that's a function of the cadence and how long the crank is.
Right. Just how fast is that pedal traveling around the circle? What's the speed?
Okay, so I have a question then.
Okay.
And I think maybe our listeners are going to have the same question. That is, okay, so if the power is the same, which is the external, basically we're measuring an external force, what's
Mhm.
happening internally in the cardiovascular system? Is there any difference when we're talking about crank length and or cadence on the internal mechanisms?
Yeah, no, that's the study I'm talking about with efficiency. When you control for pedal speed, then there's no difference at all in efficiency associated with crank length. So metabolic cost,
Right.
or VO2 or heart rate, if you like those, easier to measure, of course. Those won't change if you get on short cranks and long cranks, but you change cadence so that the pedal speed is the same.
But then if I have the same crank length, if I pedal faster, but I keep the power the same, that does change the metabolic efficiency, correct?
Yeah. Pedal speed affects efficiency for sure.
Yeah.
Higher cadences or lower efficiency. Yeah.
So then how do we determine, I mean, if it's not self-selected, how do I determine what's my optimal cadence?
For submaximal?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is that I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah.
And the reason is, if you look at metabolic efficiency, and if that's your key measure, that's the only thing you care about, efficiency peaks out at really low cadences that nobody's going to race at. Actually, that's not true. If you've been around long enough, you might remember that the East Germans, who used to be world team time trial champions every year, they at one time came out with massive chain rings that would allow their team to go 60 RPM at race pace. And they actually led for the first 3/4 of the race, and then they just detonated. So they were more efficient, they were more powerful until they weren't.
Yeah,
And then
they just fatigued too quickly.
They did fatigue, yeah.
It's
Now maybe they could have done something differently, but yeah, they didn't finish, and yeah.
And it's interesting in our world of triathlon, especially, right? Because we don't want to fatigue to the point where, well, number one, our power drops off significantly, or number two, we still have to run.
Mhm.
And so, we look at some of these professional triathletes, especially, and there's a big variety of cadences, right? Where some people are down near 60, and then some people are up at 90 and 95. And I always contend that, maybe the self-selected is best for triathlon in particular, because I think that your neurologic or neuromuscular fatigue is more important in a triathlete than a time trialist, for example, that when they're done, they're done.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you don't want to be done coming off the bike because you got a long way to go.
You got a long way to go still. Exactly. Well, that's such a good answer. Thank you.
So I want to get back to climbing, because we had a question on Facebook about climbing, and we talked a little bit about crank length and climbing. How about cadence in climbing?
Mm.
So this gets interesting, and it's pretty geeky. So cadence in climbing is actually not all that much about power. It's about a subject called two-wheel vehicle dynamics. So there are equations that govern how a bicycle or a motorcycle goes down the road. And there are two key outcomes. There's a weave frequency and a wobble frequency. And wobble frequency is what you don't want, but some bikes give you once in a while. The weave frequency is just how it goes down the road, like that, like you're always used to. And the equations are pretty complex. There's a guy from MIT that does some talks on that. But basically, you have to think about your bike is going to weave. It's going to do this. And what I think you want, and I've never done this study, I think it would be fun to do. I have some anecdotal things to bring up, but I think that what you do, because every time you pedal, you're perturbing the bike, right? You're pushing on one side or leaning on the other. And so that causes the bike to go into its weave. And what I truly believe is that we self-select cadence. If you're an experienced cyclist, you self-select cadence to cancel out the weave or to take advantage of it, if you will. And the reason I can say this with, I'll take off my scientist hat and put on my bike racer hat. And I will propose to you that you, as experienced cyclists, you're out on a ride, you see another rider off in the distance. You can't see the bike, you can't see shaved legs, you can't see the kit, but you know somehow whether that person knows how to ride a bike or not. You just know.
Yeah.
You can tell a newbie from a good rider at, you know, a kilometer or whatever. And I think that is due to what extent are they pedaling to match their bike's steering dynamics. Okay. And I have to tell you that it's a really funny story, because I was thinking about this on a bike ride. I was up one of the local canyons. I came over the top of a climb, and I was just thinking this through. I'm like, I wonder if that, and literally within seconds, I started the descent, and coming up was a guy, complete newbie on a just, you know, $80 department store bike. And he's climbing a really steep canyon, not very fast, but at like 110 RPM. And his bike is just like this. And I'm like, oh, there's the opposite example. So I really think that what you're doing when you self-select cadence, I mean, assuming you have a choice, right? Around here in the canyons, my first gear is my choice. And that's going to be that a lot of times. But if you have the choice, I think it has to do with synchronizing your pedaling with your bike's characteristics.
That's awesome.
That's probably not the answer you
No.
wanted.
I think it's a fabulous answer. And you know, the anecdote I'm going to go with is, if I jump on a mountain bike, which I very rarely ride, I feel like a newbie, right? I could put in 9,000 miles on my bike a year, and I might put in 200 on my mountain bike, right? But I just feel that like I'm not in sync with the bike.
Yeah.
And
well,
I think so I think there's something to this, and I think it literally can be about the bicycle as well.
Yeah, it is. So if you think about touring bikes with different steering geometry versus road race bikes versus mountain bikes, they're all going to be different. And my suspicion is, and I actually think I've seen a paper on this, I think self-selected cadence does change between mountain bike riders and road riders. So yeah, it's all about, I think it's all about two-wheel vehicle dynamics. So, but boy, those equations are ugly. John, you can look them up.
Yeah, no, we'll have to. And you know, it's funny, we talked about this a few years ago. And now, one of my doctoral students, Alina Swafford, is looking at the sway of a bike. And
oh, good.
Yeah, she's putting cyclists on a board, a sway board, if you will, on a stationary cycle. And she's going to quantify that sway back and forth and see if she can detect a difference between experienced and inexperienced cyclists. Oh, maybe I'm blowing our subject pool here. So
don't blow the subject pool. But you know, if you really think about it, John, if we go onto a trainer that doesn't have sway,
yeah,
right, or you go to the gym and get on a spin bike, and you don't have that sway, it doesn't feel the same, right? And the power output it's not the same, and that's why everyone's, you know, not everyone, but a lot of people are going to rocker boards or going to these, you know, so they actually have that sway. You know, I would contend that maybe if I have no sway, I can put out more power for a short amount of time, but I don't know. You know, I actually don't know the answer to that, but I think for a long time, for like riding, you know, for like an hour hard, I want to have that sway. This is really interesting stuff, and like I said, I don't know the answers to this, but.
Well, and one more anecdote here, and Jim, I may have told you this story, and Ted, you and I know it, is that Alistair Brownlee was coming through town to do a race up in St. George, and we were able to meet up and go biking with him. And
oh, cool.
Yeah, and you know, Alistair, he's not a very imposing figure if you just look at him, but he got on that bike, and both Ted and I commented afterwards, like, "Oh, he's a cyclist." You just knew he knew what he
Yeah.
was doing on the bike. And so what we saw, I have no idea, but I love this idea of synchronizing cadence with sway or the travel of the bike. That's really super interesting.
I think it goes back to, even John and I, one of our main things we talk about is one of the ways to become a better cyclist or better triathlete is consistency, right? And consistency in training and time after time after time. And I think that we've talked about efficiency here. And I think matching this up over decades and time on the bike, you just become more efficient. And I think it's matching, once again, your cadence to your sway, to your balance, to all of these things that are innate in we think they're innate in good cyclists, but I think it's more innate to the time you spend on the bicycle.
Well, yeah. So interesting you bring that up because so there's a lot of controversy about humans having fiber type shifts, fast to slow conversion.
Yep.
But we do know that if you look at elite cyclists, they have a lot more slow twitch fiber relatively, and they're more efficient. And so there's a relationship between fiber type distribution and efficiency. There's no direct evidence that humans can change fiber type distribution with exercise, but there is huge amounts of evidence in animal models using chronic motor neuron stimulation protocols, where they stimulate the muscle for 6 to 8, sometimes 12 hours a day, and when they do that, you see pretty rapid within a few weeks. You see these big changes in fiber type distribution. So, for instance, they'll do it with a fast twitch motor muscle, and it'll convert to slow twitch in a few weeks. So is that unique to animal models, or if you think about elite or at least even avid human cyclists, the pros go to Mallorca in February.
Yeah.
They go there to ride 6 to 8 hours a day. And they may have all kinds of reasons that they think they're doing it, and those reasons might be true, but I would think that part of that is that they're going to do some fast to slow conversion with huge mileage. And it's not just cyclists. Hell Week and swimmers, which has become Hell 2 weeks. How many hours are they in the pool for 2 weeks in December? And how much does that mimic a chronic stem model? And that's a study that's just waiting to be done. The problem is those people aren't necessarily going to let you biopsy them. So anyway, sorry, that probably wasn't where you wanted.
This is why I love talking with you. I've never thought about that and had yet read that. I think that's such an interesting idea. So yeah, okay. So now that made me think. We advocate strength training so much for endurance athletes now. That almost seems to counter that. Or how does that work into this idea that the training is converting fibers over to slow twitch?
Okay, yeah. So you can strength train and not hypertrophy. So you can strength train. You can be stronger, but not be heavier. So that's, first of all, that's good. And secondly, there are studies showing that in endurance athletes who strength train, their performance times are better. In a lab, controlled environment, before and after strength training, they ride faster. They ride more powerfully. There is a group in Norway, Hoff and Helgerud, Jan Hoff and Jan Helgerud, and their answer to every question is explosive half squats. So it improves soccer performance, it improves cross-country ski performance, it improves cycling performance. And what I think it really does is it improves activation and deactivation kinetics. So here's what we haven't talked about yet. We did talk about cadence. What's important about cadence aside from how it contributes to pedal speed, which is muscle shortening velocity, but cadence determines how often you or how quickly you turn your muscle on and off.
Mm.
So if you're cycling at 90 RPM, let me go even numbers so I don't mess it up. You're cycling at 120 RPM, which is what sprinters typically do. Then you're doing one cycle in half a second, and you're doing half a cycle, right? An extension phase in a quarter of a second. So you got 250 milliseconds to turn your muscle on, produce force while it shortens, and turn it off so that it doesn't produce negative power on the upstroke. Mm-hmm. And muscles take time to become activated, and they take a lot more time to become deactivated. And so cadence becomes important within the construct that muscles have to become activated and deactivated. And so when Hoff and Helgerud do these partial squats, we know that the explosive training improves both time to reach peak tension and time to relax. And so I think that's what they're doing more than the strengthening, or well, at least as much as the strengthening, they're also giving the muscle faster activation, deactivation dynamics.
I love that, and I think that gives a little bit of evidence that when I do my easy ride, that I'm actually working on the coordination part, and that's just as purposeful, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
And I love this topic too. One of the questions that often comes up, especially with newer cyclists, is, and they sometimes get some, I don't know, even bad advice about, like, you're trying to try and hold that pedal stroke as go around as you can. Well, you're not allowing for time for your muscles to turn off, right? And it's the turn off, turn on that's important, and it's not just on, and how much relaxation you have is, or not even relaxation, but just off you have, is actually quite important. I'm super glad you brought this up.
Yeah. So we've, I've been on one paper with Tom Korf, and then there's another one that actually came out at the same time, a French group whose first author I'm not getting right now, but we both did the same thing. We measured metabolic costs, so expired gases, and we gave the cyclists instructions. So in the study I did with Tom, self-selected pedaling technique. Then we said, emphasize the pushing, just stomp as hard as you can, and it pretty much just looked like the self-selected. And then we said, emphasize pulling. And the fourth one was make it a circle, which meant push over the top and pull across the bottom. And we did two metrics. One of them is called pedal force effectiveness. And what that tells you, of the pedal force you produce, how much of it is perpendicular to the crank, so it's causing the crank to go around in a circle. And so when they pulled up and when they pedaled in a circle, they had higher pedal force effectiveness. And probably every cyclist out there went, yes, I can do that too. But counterintuitively, when they did that, they were less efficient, a lot less efficient. So there's two studies that are really well done, well controlled, that both show the same thing. And when you get out in social media and you talk about these, the argument is mostly from, what's the power crank guy? Frank Day, mostly from Frank Day. He will say things like, well, that's because it was an acute intervention. You told them do it and they could do it, but that didn't mean they knew how to do it, right? And okay, fair enough. Maybe there's a learning effect that we didn't account for in the study that I did with Tom. But here's where it gets fun. So I'm going up the canyon one day, and I see a Paralympic rider. I won't share his name, but this guy was a 4-time Paralympic champion. He is a complete femoral amputee. He has no stump. It was bone cancer. He has to slow down to ride with me. I mean, the guy is ripping fit, and one thing and another, and I, struck up a conversation with him, and eventually he came in, visited my lab. And so what we did was we let him pedal like he always does, which is, with one pedal completely empty or not even screwed on. But then we put a big counterweight on the other side, and the counterweight balances out the weight of the limb so that you don't have to pull up. Okay, so we measured metabolic cost. He pedaled like he always pedals, and his efficiency was not very good, but interestingly was almost exactly like the studies when they asked people to pull up. So it was low efficiency. And then we put the counterweight on, and it's actually kind of heartbreaking. He gets back on, he takes a few pedal strokes, and he just drops his head and looks straight at the crank for a while, and he looks straight at me, and he goes, "Oh God, this is so much easier."
Yeah.
And his efficiency went up by about 11% immediately, with no practice, right? He didn't have to learn to pedal with the counterweight. But this is exactly the change that we saw when we told people to pull up. And so it's exactly what you were saying a little while ago, which is turning off the muscle is important. And what I think happens is, when you're trying to emphasize pulling up, you are sending very conflicting messages to your muscle coordination, and so that you're having antagonistic muscle contraction. So you're fighting against yourself is how I interpret that. So in that paper's in JAP, and we actually wrote something you don't get to write in science very often. We said, we hope this is the final nail in the coffin of the pedaling technique debate. Now, it's probably not, but it should be. So anyway.
I have a question for you, and this is a little bit off topic, but so if you have somebody, so my world is a lot about rehabilitation. I'm an athletic trainer, and we do a lot of cycling, especially people like with an ACL, like the ACL reconstruction. And oftentimes we start out with like single leg on the opposite side for cross pollination, as it were. If we were to put a weight on the other, where the other pedal was, would they be able to, they'd be more efficient on that single leg then?
Yeah, that's right. And they'd be able to do a lot more power.
Yep.
Then they would look, they'd actually be able to, we've done a lot with single leg cycling in my lab. It's the most potent training stimulus that nobody uses.
Yeah.
And we thought that we had stumbled onto this ourselves. It turns out papers on single leg training go back to the 70s. Every study that's ever been done using single leg cycling, with the caveat that there is some sort of pedaling assistance for the missing leg weight, right? There are spring systems, there are motor driven systems. We use a counterweight. You can use a fixed gear. Any number of interventions facilitate pedaling the way you normally do, but with one leg at a time. When you do that, you upregulate the muscle respiratory proteins just through the roof. And so we actually have done some studies recently with, we call it single leg emphasis. Just leave. So we think one of the reasons that it doesn't catch on is because who's got a counterweighted bike, right? Who's got a counterweighted ergometer? Nobody has one. But everybody's got two legs. And if you happen to look down at your leg, you'll notice they're about the same size. And so one leg is a pretty good counterweight for the other leg.
Right.
And so if you just decide that you're going to pedal with one and keep the other one relaxed, you can actually do between 70 and 90% of the work with your on leg, and just keep the other one passive, relatively passive. So that's a little different than where you were going with it. We're also doing ACL and stroke rehab, and we could talk about that too. But Yeah, so single leg cycling is tremendously potent. When we did the study, John Howley pulled the gels for us, and it's pretty funny. So I did this when I was on sabbatical in Australia, and he Skyped me one day, and he said, "Jim, I got to tell you, these training data on respiratory proteins are unbelievable. In fact, I didn't believe them. So I hope you don't mind, but I used more of your tissue and I pulled the gels again myself, and I got the same results." And so, yes, it is unbelievably potent at upregulating respiratory proteins.
Hmm.
But nobody has access to the ergometers, but everybody's got access to their own bike, and everybody can just decide to leave one of their legs passive for a while. And you can, the beauty of that is, think of it this way: you've got a central capacity that's limited, and that delivers oxygenated blood to your two legs, right? If you're pedaling with two legs, each leg can only get half of that oxygen. And so, mitochondria are expensive to maintain. And so there's no reason for your body to upregulate mitochondrial density beyond what it takes to metabolize half of your central capacity. Now, if you had more, it'd be good, but it's hard to get more. Unless I wave my Harry Potter magic wand and I give you twice your VO2 max for a day of training. And then you can upregulate your mitochondrial density. Of course, I can't do that, but what I can do is send you out to ride with one leg.
So do you, just because I'm wondering, do you think it's more delivering more oxygen, or you're producing more carbon dioxide, and that might be more of one of the stimulus for the mitochondrial density? I mean, I think I've come across something like that before in the literature.
Yeah, I think it's both.
Yeah.
First of all, because you're sending a lot more oxygenated blood to that leg.
Yeah.
And if you do this, you'll be shocked that after about 5 minutes of hard single leg, you'll look down and your leg will be bright red and engorged.
Mm.
It's really remarkable. But then higher blood flow creates higher shear stress in the vessels, which activates PGC1 alpha, which increases capillary density. But then the other thing is, you essentially become untrained when you do single leg, because now you've got your lactates are your lactate threshold now, instead of being 80% of VO2 max, maybe it's 40% of VO2 max.
Right.
And what happens then is you can actually ride way above single leg lactate threshold, and it hurts like hell, but you don't fail. You can just stay there. You can get that metabolic soup just simmering and keep it simmering for a long time. And, so that metabolic stress, which is what you're talking about, is another contributor to upregulating.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. And in fact, I messed around with it as an athlete, single leg cycling on the rollers, which was not easy. But
Yeah.
does it matter if you're doing single leg cycling over the road, which would look awkward, or on a trainer where the bike is fixed, or something free like rollers?
Well, keep in mind, I do not advocate bicycling magazine style pedaling drills.
Mm-hmm.
Most single leg cycling is all about pedaling in a circle, which is actually counterproductive. So single leg with a counterweight it allows you to maintain your normal biomechanics and just train the living hell out of one leg at a time. And you can do the same thing by keeping both legs clipped in, but leaving one relaxed.
Oh, I love this. Jim, this is fantastic. Okay, Ted, I don't know where you are with questions, but
Go ahead.
we're almost there. I'm gonna go off biking. Well, no, I'm still biking, but off this topic just a little bit. There's two kinds of cyclists: those that have crashed and those that are going to. So what's your crash story?
Oh, well, Well, let's see. I guess I've got a couple, or more. One kind of fun and one kind of not fun. I was actually doing match sprints at the Colorado Springs Velodrome, and I was racing a guy on the national team who didn't like me very much, and he crashed me in the home straight, and it was pretty interesting because his thigh hit my handlebars, and so my handlebars jacked, and it was the weirdest, physics, because the bike went upside down. So I was literally flying down the home straight, upside down, still clipped in and still on the bars. And I landed on my back and my helmet whipped onto the track. And it was, this is a long time ago when it was lycra covered foam. The foam goes there all over the track. And I slide all the way down the home straight. I basically come to a stop right on the start finish. And somehow or other, I come to a stop basically with my legs out, sitting up. And I look up and I'm looking right at the stands. And the stands are like, dead silence. But I lost a lot of skin, but I wasn't hurt. And I looked up and I saw him and I go, safe. and I got a huge laugh out of it, just like that.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's a fun one. A not so fun one is I was commuting home right before the pandemic, actually, and I was in a bike lane with solid lines, but with parking spaces on the right.
Ooh, yeah.
And a woman just hit me, just bang. Like every cyclist, I've been dodging cars my whole life.
Yeah.
My first indication that I might be in danger was actually being hit. There was zero warning. This woman went, "Oh, parking space!" Boom. And look, I got to tell you something. You and I, we probably have a sense for right and wrong. We have morals, and we think that laws actually reflect morals. And one of those would be that hitting a cyclist with a car is wrong. I can tell you, this woman was not charged. She wasn't even given a ticket. Because, in the officer's opinion, there was no evil intent and she was sufficiently remorseful that he didn't need to cite her. And actually even that, I'm in my 60s, but I still bounced, right? I bounced up, I stood up, wasn't very happy about it, but I thought it was going to be okay. I thought it was just like a really ugly crash, but I can't believe I'm telling this in public. But I had this hematoma on my hip from because the car had hit me on the hip, and then I had swerved and fallen on that hip. In blue jeans, and so I guess that really like yanked on the skin. So I had this hematoma, but it kept getting bigger, and like a lot bigger, like grapefruit. And so it turns out it wasn't a hematoma. It was called a closed degloving injury, which means that the skin has become detached from the underlying tissue. And I go into the surgeon and he says, all right, well, you got three options. You can do nothing and maybe it'll reattach, but it won't, it's too big. We could drain it and wrap it and maybe it would reattach, but it won't. And you'd probably get an infection, which would be bad. Or we can do surgery. Well, okay, gee, let me pick. So I go in for surgery and then I'm in the recovery room and I go, okay, look, in my whole life of cycling, I like to say that when things really go to shit, you can start looking forward to telling a good story. So what's my good story here? How many stitches did you put in me? Because he's got to take an area this big and somehow tie it back down to the underlying tissue. And he goes, well, we don't really do stitches, we do sutures. Okay, how many sutures? He says 5. That's not much of a good story.
Yeah.
Goes, well, each one's 20 inches long. And so evidently what they did, they opened this thing up and then they went in and started quilting.
Oh,
And they just came in circles and circled in with 100 inches
oh,
of suturing.
oh, boy.
So those are my two crash stories. I can't
Oh.
believe I just told you that one.
No, that's great.
great,
And
yeah.
I know that this is why a lot of people like to ride inside because there are stories like this, but it is a dangerous sport or activity. But no, those are great. I love each of them, and the velodrome one. I can only imagine how fast you're going. Well, Jim,
Yeah.
this has been fantastic. I already wrote down a couple of experiment ideas, so this is really this is excellent. So thank you
Okay,
so much.
let's collaborate. I'll look forward to it.
That was great.
Totally. No, you've been very generous with your time and really appreciate you doing this.
Okay, well, I hope it's interesting to your listeners.
I'm sure it is. All
But
right.
if it
Thanks.
wasn't to them, it was to us. So that's all that really matters.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough.
All
All
right.
right.
Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Bye.